Well, the doors are closed, everyone. I guess we are about to get started. Hi. Thanks for coming. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and start off by introducing our lovely panelists. But before I do that, I wanted to go ahead and ask, what are your guys' preferred pronouns?
I'm he, him.
I'm she, her.
He, him.
And I am he, him as well. So first we have joining us is the lovely Cynthia Hornbeck. I always say your last name wrong,
It's
so
fine.
I apologize. Cynthia is an RPG contributor for Shut Up and Sit Down, and has worked for FFG Asmodee over 2 years managing PR and social media. We also have Fred Wan. He is co-story lead for Legend of the Five Rings, RPG and CCG for over 12 years. And he's also a lovely person. And
The check cleared.
And last but not least is Jonathan Ying. Jonathan is a game designer with a background in fiction writing and animation. His design credits include Star Wars, Imperial Assault, to Doom, the board game. His latest project is the Kickstarter game Bargain Quest, which I had the pleasure of playing a couple nights ago. It's very good, everyone. Go get it.
It's good.
So, this panel is to discuss the issue of diversity in art and design, and talking about how we feel about that topic and how we hope that it can improve across the industry. But first, we wanted to talk about what is diversity and how do we each want to see that represented in the industry. If Cynthia, want to go ahead and start us off?
Sure. For me, there's several different angles, and it's important to realize that like each sort of angle or underrepresented human is its own unique thing. So for example, there's clearly a problem of racial and ethnic diversity in both the gaming community and in depictions in board games. That is a very different and unique problem than the way that women are depicted in board games, and the role of women within the gaming community today is a different problem from the place of GLBTQ people in board games in the community is a different problem from the place of people dealing with disabilities in the community. So for me, talking about diversity, it's not just one issue. Each of these groups has just historically different aspects. There's intersections. There's no single diversity problem that can be solved. It's much more multifaceted and complex than that.
Right, we are all different individuals. We all have different experiences. Even people that fit necessarily the same quote-unquote stats have different experiences and may feel differently on how things are represented and how they interact with different things that they come across. So it's not always about making sure that every game is everything for everybody, because that's impossible. That is a huge task. No one could ever do that. But it's about being mindful of the fact that we can be better.
Yeah.
So, guys, one of the things that I wanted to talk about having you all here on this panel, when I was thinking about putting this panel together, I'd asked Paul, who are the best people to talk with me about these issues? And he brought you guys up in a second. So I wanted to know, what is your love of board games and why you decided to become more than just the average customer, become more involved in the industry? So Jonathan, you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. Well, so, I mean, the thing I love about board gaming, and the thing that it kind of gave me, that thing that very little else did at the time when I got into it, was this sense of kind of community and being there with people. Like, when I was a little growing up, right, like I played Smash Bros with my friends, and we'd all get together, we'd all like eat snacks and, play together. And that was a wonderful experience that slowly became less and less true of games in general as games started moving to more online play, more single-player content. And board games filled this wonderful niche of making these beautiful social experiences where you can see your friends and play together and take up these roles, everything from like D&D to, everything we have in these halls, right? Like, and that's kind of why I love board games, and again, how I feel that diversity is important, because being able to see yourself in these games and being able to see, like, I want more people playing, and the more people who feel welcome and who can see why we get so excited about these things, the better and the stronger our industry is going to get.
Cynthia, so what attracted you to board games?
So I actually came to this hobby really, really late in life, and I have not been part of it for very long at all. But I had made new friends through the theater community in Minneapolis, and they were like, well, you should come play board games and RPGs. And I was like, no. And they were like, yes, you should. And then I just kept playing games with them, and I quit my PhD program for totally other reasons and needed a job and somehow got hired by FFG. I will say, strangely enough, like the game that sort of hooked me into like contemporary gaming happened to be Eldritch Horror. It was very, very convenient that happened. And also the community that I was integrated into was already filled with couples and very diverse and had a lot of sort of gender and sexuality diversity. So I didn't get a sense for the first few months I was in the industry until Gamergate hit of the extent to which, especially like gender issues, were problematic.
Awesome. Fred,
So
what about yourself?
I came from more of a role-playing game and card game background and then transitioned into more board gaming. And for me, a lot of it was just you get a different experience in board gaming. It's much role-playing games tend to take up all of your mental headspace when you're playing them. You can't do anything else, or you're disrupting the game. Competitive card games have their own cultural issues and social issues, right? But the idea of let's all get together, we're going to relax, even though we're playing something where we're thinking, is something that is a little bit more of a feature of board games, right? There is a way to get to know the people around the table without necessarily requiring a lot of emotional investment in the same way an ongoing RPG campaign does, that I really treasure about the board game space.
So for myself, I didn't even know the board game world existed when I was growing up. The only board game I knew was like Monopoly, like everybody else. And my friends had started playing the Dragon Ball Z CCG when I was like in middle school, and that's kind of like, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Let me go ahead and try this out. And I started playing with those characters and designing my own decks just with the stuff that they gave me. I didn't really have any money, and nor did my parents have any disposable income to do so. And as like I kept growing up, I kind of left that behind me, and board games didn't really come back into my life until after I came back from college. I dropped out and met up with those friends again, and they were all into board games now. And I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. These are really cool, different mechanics and stuff like that. And it gave me something that I thought I would never get back, because after I left Arizona, where I went to college, I was part of a church group, and I was kicked out of my church because they found out I was gay. And when that happened to me, I went through a lot of turmoil in my life that I kind of never thought I would be able to gain the community and the love that I had from my church community again ever. And when I got into board games and started socializing with some of those old friends, and they started introducing me to other friends and started introducing me to more board games and bigger groups and things like that, I started to feel that spark again. I started to feel that love, that community again, that I had felt like I was never going to get back just because of who I was. And that was something I was still struggling with. I still didn't even tell most of the people that I was meeting in those board game groups that I was gay, because I was still scared. But luckily, a lot of those people ended up being very accepting, very nice, very welcoming, and that is why I love board games. That is why I love this industry so much, because to me personally, it gave me a sense of community, a sense of hope, a sense of love that I thought I could never have outside of religion. And I think that sometimes we all think that, no, we're just playing games. You know, we're just moving around these tokens. We're just, you know, trying to beat our friends and stuff like that. But these interactions, these opportunities to sit down at a table and look at each other and laugh with each other and sometimes get angry at each other and cry with each other is something more than just a box.
Yeah. I mean, it's this interesting paradox in the board game and tabletop and RPGs communities that for so many people, these forms of geekdom our home, and they're places where we feel comfortable when you don't feel comfortable anywhere else. And board gaming can be very, very welcoming and opening. And at the same time, you inevitably run into something, like for me as a woman, I inevitably run into something that just makes me feel enormously squicky. And it's very jarring, right? Because you're like, oh, but this is my world, this is my home, and then all of a sudden there's maybe someone saying, no, actually this is mine, and you don't belong in it. Yeah, sorry, that was really dark.
No, I mean, because of the way that we all feel about this hobby, we are noticing these problems that are coming up, that are existing, that, hey, like, I open this box, there's all these characters here, and no one looks like me. No one is telling my story. No one is, even, this world doesn't exist with me in mind.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times that can just kind of take you out of it. And the more that you think about these issues, the more prevalent it becomes. And it's harder and harder to just let it go. And as people that are involved in the industry, we have a certain responsibility to say something and try to influence things in the best way we can. So what are some issues that you guys notice in board games that are problematic in how necessarily characters are represented, how stories are told, and things like that, that we could probably start working towards a better solution?
One thing that I would start with is most board games are mechanistically about problem solving. So to the extent humans matter, it's what can you do? How useful are you? So before you've even begun the conversation, you're extremely ableist, because if someone is unfit, but however you define unfit, they're out, right? If they, and that's something we don't examine very often, but it says something, because it means, for example, you don't see very many people who are overweight in board games, like in the portrayals in games. You don't see someone who needs a little bit of medical assistance. You almost never see someone who has a mechanical effect of a psychological disorder. Or if you do, often it's a defining trait of the character where you have to give huge mechanical buffs elsewhere or no one will play them. And I think it's one of those things diversity examinations don't talk about that much, but it's one that worries me a lot, because it means there is an underlying assumption of valuation that is not being critically reflected on.
I think there's, there are some strong examples of people trying to push it forward, Isaac.
Right.
If you look at Dead of Winter, they've got an incredibly inclusive cast, including characters with various disabilities that are not defined by that disability. And so, on the front of, like, we are analyzing some of the issues in the industry, I do think it's also valuable to look at how we are doing well and ways we can keep doing things that well, right? So, props to you, Isaac.
Oh, thank
You're
you.
a cool guy.
Well, it's not just me also. Like, it's, whenever we do a game, it's not just a singular person. No matter what happens, it's artists, it's studio managers, it's people that are doing graphic design. It's all these people coming together and saying, this is important to us. This is something that we want to make sure that we do as we move forward. And when somebody falls and isn't thinking about it, it's an opportunity for someone else to pick you up and say something. And it's an opportunity for the consumer to say also, because you guys have great power. Your dollars are what you vote with, are what you're saying, this is valuable to me. And every time that you spend your money on something that you don't necessarily believe in, or don't feel is doing a good enough job at representing you as a person, or your friends, or your neighbor, or your sister, or your brother, or your family, that's saying it's okay. It's okay to let this go.
And I think there's a lot of push, depending on your group or who's at the table, there's a lot of push to be okay with things or let them go. Sorry, here I go. so Conan was one for me where it's like, okay, you still have to be on board with us. You still have to market this thing, which you find, just morally icky. But that happens throughout the community at the table. Like, all right, we're all going to sit down and play this game, and I want you to join us, but there is no one like you in this game who is wearing reasonable clothing, or there is no one like you in this game who has, indigeneity, or who is, working with like a visual impairment or something like that. And you have the choice to say no. You have the choice to either be to stand up for yourself, or to be even better, be an ally and say like, no, I don't think we should, devote our attention to this thing, which is underrepresenting, misrepresenting, objectifying our friends and neighbors.
It is really uncomfortable to speak up about that, right? Because no one wants to be the person to make this less fun, right? The party pooper, to be the wet blanket on, well, this thing makes me uncomfortable in this fun game we're all supposed to be enjoying together. And that's sort of a difficult situation no matter how you cut it, right? And so I think as a community, we should try and be very aware of that and comfortable with, talking it out and just asking, hey, are you okay with this? Looking out for our friends, right? Our friends and our peers in these cases.
Because we want this space to end up being better for all of us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And more fun for more people more often.
Mm-hmm.
And that means some of that development is going to involve individual conversations that in those days and in those moments are less fun. That's a sacrifice. That is a play. We're all gamers. We all understand the idea of making a play that hurts us right now for the medium and long term, right? And it's a stark and painful and daunting prospect. And you will decide as individuals, is it worth it tonight? Is it worth it tomorrow? Is it worth it at this con? Is it worth it at my store? But the cumulative result of all of our decisions as individuals are what define our community, right? It's all very well and good to say our community is inclusive, but if none of us individually makes choices that make them inclusive, then that's not true.
So I actually have a great positive example that I saw within the past hour or so. A friend who's actually, I think, an art director now at FFG, shared on Facebook the Facebook post of this group called Feminist 40K for the Warhammer 40K. And they wrote publicly on Facebook to Games Workshop saying, well, we love this IP, we love your games, we love playing Warhammer, but there aren't enough female sculpts, apart from the Dark Elves and the Adeptus Sororitas. So
Battle nuns.
yeah, so GW, here are some suggestions for different ways to handle that. Talk to us. And GW did, which is this huge moment of seeing the landscape change as we speak. And GW said, here's, we are currently working on ways to, incorporate more female models, especially into our sort of Imperium faction builds. Here's what we're doing. We thank you for your feedback. We thank you for how well constructed it was. We will keep this conversation going. The post is all public on Facebook. Just look for Feminist 40K. And I don't know that this would have happened even 5 years ago. But here are people actually just saying, look, here's a thing you can do to make everything more inclusive for everyone. And Games Workshop, it turns out, it was already on the ball because they've already heard these complaints for months now.
It's a positive sea change, but I remember they also did note that, on the development end, right, these games take time. So they've gotten this feedback, but it'll take a couple of years before this content might come out. And until
They're
then,
saying we're working on models now, which means that you'll see them on the streets in about 9 months, if not longer.
9 months, if not 2 years. Right, yeah,
Right.
they are adding, and there have been a couple very iconic, hey, this new character is, a female, whatever the Age of Sigmar, not Space Marines are that they have in the new fantasy setting. And that's really cool. But then occasionally they still flub it up because they have this whole in-universe reason why Space Marines have to be men, because of their lore that oh, hey, kind of it's just women are genetically incompatible with the space gene seed that we've magically made, in the same way that women can't be witchers in, The Witcher. And I've never really understood that because it's you're manufacturing lore reasons to carry over real
Well, there was actually just mentioned in that post, and I have time to pursue it, a mention about the change in the lore supposedly opening up room for more female models in a certain faction.
True, but like, and yet they didn't do that with the Primarch Space Marines. They've reintroduced a new, just basically so they can have taller Space Marine models. It was
The Primaris Marines?
Yeah, yeah, and they're like super cool models, but you know, it's like, hey, here's a new breed of Space Marine with a new GNC that's super cool. They could have just written one piece of text like, and hey, it works on women now too. But nope, that's so, you know, small steps, right?
It's funny that you guys you bring up that subject, and I told you guys earlier when we were having a little meeting before the panel that when I was working on developing Dead of Winter, one of the things that came up is someone asked me, is it really believable that all these people with different backgrounds all exist in the same town? And I'm just like, but zombies are fine. Like, zombies are fine, that's cool, but all of this doesn't work out.
They're fine with the dog that can like read a book and tell like.
That dog is really smart.
And it's just, it's one of those things. It's funny because sometimes it feels like it's unfathomable. Yeah. And you know, one of my favorite shows is Game of Thrones. I love it so much. Like, there's so much history, there's so much great story there's so much great characters. But all of the characters that I look like, well, not like that, but all of the characters that I could potentially be are somehow representative of, you know, savages or slaves in some sort of way. I can never be the knights. Yeah. I can never be the lord. You know, and that, it's a fantasy world. Why not?
So, I mean, like what we've sort of gotten onto this topic already. What do you guys think of this idea that's often cited of, oh, we're being true to the setting now? Like, we can't have a more diverse cast because that's not how the setting was originally designed.
I think Hamilton blew that shit out of the water.
Yeah.
But, and I agree in outcome, but I do want to point out that there are often times where an individual artist, an individual creator, an individual writer will be told by the owners of the IP, this is how you're doing it. Oh, we're going to find someone who does it the way we want. And those are tough calls that individual creators have to make because you've got to eat. And if you want to be in a position where you have the skills and the experience and the clout to do a better job on something original, you've got to build your skills somehow, right? And I'm not saying that as an excuse at all. What I'm saying is we need to collectively be informed on the various things that are going into the decisions people are making so that our responses and our suggestions are constructive rather than unrealistic, right? You really shouldn't be telling someone who literally can't pay their rent, don't do that because, or maybe you should, right? Don't do that because it is regressive in some way. Or if you do, you have to acknowledge the solemnity of what you're asking them to sacrifice because some people will make those calls, right? I have talked to artists who have told me flat out because some of their revenue comes from print sales. I make more money when I focus on drawing beautiful women who are scantily clad, a lot more. People don't buy as much of my other prints. And then they make those other prints anyways. But if we recognize that that's the sacrifice they're making and inform ourselves and respond accordingly, it's a little bit easier for them to make that next step.
It's good that you brought up the artist point. One of the things that, as an art director, I struggled when I had that position as my job was informing the artist to be diverse was not enough. You had to provide them with actual references. You had to provide them with actual different people because of the fact that for them, and this doesn't matter where the artist is from, where they're based. I work with multiple artists that are all across the world, all different backgrounds. The default is white. Mm-hmm. The default is white, and that is not a problem with just our industry. That is across the board. You know, the movies that they're watching, the comics that they're absorbing, the different books that they're reading, you know, the default's white. So why would they think that, hey, I need this cool heroine character, you know, why would they think that would be any other race? Right. You know, and it's not something that you can just be lazy about. Like, you have to take that extra step to bring it up. Mm-hmm. Right. You know, you have to take that extra step to say, no, we're going to try to represent, you know, someone from Ecuador, right? You know, right. And they have different facial features than maybe someone from a different Latin American country, you know. So it's things like that we have to try to make sure to bring up in the positions that we have in the battles that we can fight.
And when that affects one of your purchasing decisions or your consumer decisions, let the people who make the product or made the art or whatnot, let them know that influenced you to act positively, right? It makes them feel better, which is actually a real thing, because this is a creative industry, and sometimes it is soul-wrenching just because you're putting bits of yourself into your work. And B, then they know, and that is useful to them, because then they know that if they keep going, people have their back.
And speaking from experience, like FFG, for example, is a large company, right? We all kind of associate with being pretty big, but we're not a very large industry in general. But like, when we get this kind of feedback, when we get letters, we read them, you know? Like, people in power, like, will read them, and there is a very, you know, like a like on Facebook, no one really cares about, right? Or like an angry emoticon on Facebook. But like, you know, even a small like written letter from a human being has a huge amount of value and weight. Like, don't think that you're just shouting into the ether. Like, people are listening. Like, and those, you know, effects, like, in addition to dollars, but like when people complain about something or when people comment positively about something, that has a genuine impact. And I think that is, at the very least, going to be true as our industry is now. As it gets bigger, that may become less true. So now's a really good time to get in there, right?
Yeah, I am a huge advocate of taking the time to maybe not go online and do all of this, but maybe send a private email or a letter or something like that, because it's so easy in this day and age to get jaded on the multiple crazy comments. These things can go in so many different directions, and sometimes the intentions that weren't meant to be something negative can be twisted and construed in every which way, because this is not an easy problem to solve. And like we said earlier, it's not something that's going to satisfy everyone. We can't there's only so many characters in games, there's only so many stories that can be told. It's not necessarily going to be representative of everyone, but make yourself heard if you feel hurt, if you felt a problem wasn't addressed correctly, because that can have an impact. But sometimes when it gets into this large attacking kind of thing, people tend to like, oh, well, it's the internet. You know, it's crazy, you know, and especially in the age that we're in right now. Yeah.
So I'm just realizing that so far we've talked only about representation, and that's not, I mean, I feel like that's talked about everywhere. Like, oh, you know, this is how women are depicted, or there's, you know, never any, like, you know, Latino-looking people in this game. That's not the entirety of it. You know, I could ask Socratic questions, but it's not. And so I'm kind of like riffing off of what Isaac's got prepared. Just what are other aspects of the diversity problems that we're dealing with, or what are other ways of being inclusive? I mean, representation is one thing. It's only just a very small part of what's going on and what needs to change.
Colorblind friendly content, right? Like, that's a big deal. You know, a lot of games like colorblind people just can't play, or people who like have difficulty reading small text, or, you know, there's I forget the name of the website, but they review games by virtue of all of their accessibility.
I guess Meeples Like Us is one of them.
Right. Meeples Like Us does that, and that's really cool, and that like keeps people aware of, you know, like, we are an expensive hobby. Can we all agree on that right now? Right? Like, who has spent not a small amount of money, like, on their games library, right? And not only do you need a library, like, you need, you know, games are expensive, but also storing them is expensive. You need a home that can, you know, sustain these boxes.
Particularly in Vancouver.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so, like, accessibility on a socioeconomic level is also important. And that, informs our communities, right? Like, I think, in areas that are more impoverished, they can't support a local game store. That's just not true. And so there are, perspectives and people who we are just not serving with our industry. And whether or not we are able to do that or we can put a concerted effort towards that, I'm not entirely sure. I would like to.
Challenge all of you, all right, that have a board game on your shelf right now that is in shrink wrap that you have not touched or played in 3 years. Go ahead and give it away to someone that may not be able to afford a board game, maybe hasn't even heard a board game, or to a school. There's lots of opportunities.
Hospitals.
Hospitals, children's hospitals.
Youth centers, NYU is doing a drive right now for board games for rehabilitation facilities for teenagers in New York.
Yeah,
prisons.
Prisons.
Yeah.
Actually, seriously. Yeah.
We get so caught up in the new. There's so much noise in the industry right now. There's so much cool new stuff coming out. And there's lots of games that maybe you don't want to play anymore. It's a good opportunity to take advantage of that and do something charitable with it.
One of the things that is really awkward to actually do, but is actually a lot of value added, is I try to make sure that people have a code of behavior which is separate from a code of conduct, right? Watch your table talk, right? I challenge people when they say that's so gay, right? I don't like it, and I will quietly not re-invite people who say I'm sorry for using the language because I just have to be illustrative here. When someone says when I won and I beat someone soundly, they say I raped them. No, you don't use that language. You just don't, right? And that's largely moving out, but it's not everywhere. I also encourage people not to be generally loud and aggressive in their body language, because there are different people with different sets of social norms and social comfort levels. And there are people who are they won't come back if someone gets in their face. And even if that person is not being necessarily angry or intending to be aggressive, it's a matter of creating a comfort zone, right?
This is, this is a huge thing that allies can do. Especially at the gaming table. I think everyone at the gaming table has to understand that the person who is being talked over or who finds something that they're uncomfortable with in the game, or who's just even not having a good time, is not going to often speak up for themselves. And it's one of those ways in which, instead of just being a good friend, you really can be a good ally and give them the space to talk about what's going on. And help them find ways to make the situation better. Like in RPGs, we sometimes have something called an X card. And if you're made uncomfortable, you can just touch it. Be like, yeah, I'm feeling weird right now. And then that's a way for the GM to see that, stop everything perhaps, or keep going, depending on what's happening, and then actually address the issue. But don't always just assume as an ally that everything you're doing is perfect because your heart is in the right place. We've all been that person who talks over someone else or who forgets someone's pronoun or something like that.
A couple years ago, I was hosting Ashes tournament at Origins. And it was a small little thing that we did at Kingmakers, and it went really well, and people had a really good time. And one of my really good friends, Lindsay Rode, who is trying to make it as a game designer right now, she came up to me and is like, "Oh my gosh, it was so great. I had such a good time. No one mentioned I was a girl." And she's been through that a whole bunch. And she loves competitive games, but she stopped participating in them up until that tournament because of the fact that consistently happened to her.
Hey, who'd you come here with, right? What kind of deck does your boyfriend play?
The competitive scene can be really nasty towards women.
We discussed this a bit at the competitive games panel, actually.
And it's a job of the men to do a better job of not making it a safe place for them, not making them feel excluded, not bringing up that, hey, you're female, congratulations.
Do you want to?
I do want to raise something without attributing it to the person I got this from. I have a friend who was, again, former old L5R under AEG. She was a top tournament player, right? But an additional burden she had to carry, and every tournament she went to was, there aren't very many women at the game. I feel like everyone else here is going to judge how good women are at the game based on how well I do. And that is something that she shouldn't have had to carry, but is an additional thing weighing on her that no guy in the room can even fathom, right? And regardless of, it's not even an empathy thing. Acknowledge that there are different people with different burdens that they are carrying that you might not have even thought of.
And I think a lot of the people in this room, I have a feeling, are going to come at this in good faith and be, you know, like, I have a feeling we're mostly allies in here, right? Like, and so on that front, right? It's important to recognize that these are difficult things to talk about, right? It's hard to confront someone about this because if you do it wrong, you might even like radicalize them against you because it's like, oh, I'm not racist. What do you mean? Like, and so there are methods of addressing that sort of thing about like saying, you know, discussing the content, not the person, right? Don't say, you're being racist. Say like, that was kind of racist, or that thing you said sounded a bit problematic for XYZ reasons. And it's like, separate them from that. Because like, you kind of know that they're not here to cause a problem, or if they are, don't invite them back to the game. And there's a lot of this sort of thing that is just awkward and it's hard to be articulate about, right?
Yeah, I mean, and also don't beat everyone up for making a mistake. You know, you can talk to them, through it with them. You know, people in general in this hobby are great people. I have had so many lovely interactions with so many different people. It's just maybe they haven't known that what they were doing was an issue, you know, or offended someone, or made someone feel uncomfortable. Like, use it as as an opportunity to educate or to learn, whatever side you're on, and don't feel like it's an attack, and don't beat yourself up for making a mistake, as long as you're willing to try to correct that. Because the biggest thing is that we're here to have fun. You know, we want to have a good time. Everybody that's coming to these kind of events are here to get away from the rest of the world and all the other things that are going on, and trying to have a good time with their friends, or their hopefully new to be friends, you know? So people are going to stumble along the way, and there has to be a sense of forgiveness and a sense of wanting to learn as well on both sides.
It's a process, right?
And where you can, acknowledge the fact that the people who are doing the most forgiving are the ones who are being wronged. Honor that fact, right? You might not be able to make it easier for them, but recognize that if someone is a minority or has been excluded for whatever reason, and they've just had the good grace to be like, yes, you've used the wrong pronoun, it's chill. Recognize that that might be the 10th time that day. And you know, that doesn't mean draw attention to it, but just recognize in the back of your head that they are trying to help everyone else get there, so that they don't feel like they're alone in their aloneness.
All right. So
what you got, Isaac?
Lots of deep stuff, yes. And I wanna kind of lighten the mood a little bit, talk about some examples of things that we have seen that have gone really well, some ways that we can help improve things as well, and just talk about in general maybe some good experiences that you've had in which you felt very welcome.
Well,
as well.
As we talked about in the rulebook talk, right? Like, we had a discussion about how we're getting more and more they, them pronouns in rulebooks, right? Like, more and more games are accepting that, and like, I think, you know, was it, which guide? The Columbia guide, or some guide for language was like, hey, they singular is fine, you know? Oh, thank God.
Yeah,
I've had this fight so many times with editors. Huh? AP guide, there we go. Yes, the AP guide is like, hey, they singular. And we're like, hooray!
Yay.
How hard was that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
you know.
only took 100 years. I actually want to talk about a game that I've been actually for months talking the Shut Up and Sit Down team's ears off about, which is Urban Shadows. Raise your hand if you have heard of this, if I've talked your ear off about it yet today. So it's a game by Magpie Games, which is an indie studio that I love a lot. And Urban Shadows is not just a game about, you know, playing werewolves and vampires and ghosts in your own community. It's a game about conflicting communities. And as part of creating that experience, it encourages players to play an ethnicity or a gender or a sexuality other than their own. And of course, they've got all sorts of advice in this book on how to deal with stereotypes and confronting those. And of course, this is a very risky and brave and dangerous thing to do, and you want to be in a safe space. But I've never seen something that so overtly pushed people before or since. And in my experience playing this game, I've had friends suddenly decide to be werewolves who are African-American trans women, and Latino lawyers, and I'm trying to think back to the one I played with Dan Clark and Kat and everyone at FFG. Just a whole crazy variety of different personalities. And then once you're in that role, of course, people start investigating those actual neighborhoods and those communities. And so it goes from the game into sort of an actual better understanding of what those, it goes from the magic if of like, what if I was this person, what might that burden or that existence be like, to, oh, that's a different area of Chicago, and maybe I want to go visit that because there's all these things there that have played an important role in my life now for some reason. I highly recommend Urban Shadows, however brave or safe or whatever you want to be with it. But because it does foreground those political issues in a way that it encourages you to explore.
What I really appreciate about people today is that I feel comfortable enough to be who I am in front of them. Everybody that I have been able to tell my story to has been so nice and so helpful to my own personal self-growth, because it's not always easy to be who you are in front of everybody. So I just want to thank everyone listening who's ever been nice to me, who's ever been playing games with me, whoever has sat through me not paying attention to them telling me the rules. Thank you. Because keep doing what you're doing and helping people feel like they matter, that they're worth your time, to make them feel like, hey, you're just one of the gang. You're a friend here. Mm-hmm. So,
Fred didn't get a chance.
So I think one particular moment that really stood out for me was a year or two ago at a different con. And I'm not going to raise the name for no particular reason, but just to give an extra layer of anonymity for the people involved, I think. And we were in a long, long, long discussion of just rambling through a bunch of topics, right? But multiple people over the course of that post-panel question and answer period were talking about things like, I'm an indie dev. How do I treat my staff in a way that's sensitive? How do I reflect that in a game that's politically charged? Someone else talked about the role of games in working through trauma that they had experienced as a child, and so on, and so on, and so on. And none of the attendees had met each other before that day. And they were comfortable talking to people because they had trust that between the panelists and the particular con and each other's treatment of each other, that they would be dealt with respect and with attentiveness and with reflection, and it happened. It was magic. And that happening has given me a lot of hope for maybe even the species.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. And certainly that there are at least embers in the gaming industry of people who aren't just well-meaning, but are prepared to take the steps and the effort to try to keep that going.
So I want to ask you guys, what would you hope to see the industry as if we can implement as many things like this as possible, what would you hope to see us be at one day?
I think number one on my sort of wish list is I want to see more diverse stories. Like, representation is fantastic, and it's amazing to like open Dead of Winter and see all those characters come alive in this community. But there's a lot of moments where we are still telling the same stories in this industry over and over and over again. And there are so many other stories out there in the world to be told that exist beyond Renaissance Europe or classical Greece, or a random fantasy setting with dragons. I would like to see more and more designers and developers looking into those stories, exploring them, telling their own stories that are risky, and working with people who are experts in those communities to bring those stories to the forefront. That's sort of my dream, is to be able to like go to an RPG shelf and be like, oh, you know, here's this awesome book based on, you know, Nehayawat mythology, and oh, this is, you know, deeply rooted in the traditions of like Ming Dynasty China, and instead of having those things be superficial, fun, maybe they read a book or two, have those things be built with research and knowledge and expertise and awareness and love. Because I'm sick of experiencing like settler colonialism over here. I want to experience all the things because that's how I learn and grow as a person.
I think on a similar vein, right? Like, broadly, I would like the industry to get better, but I would also like culture to get better. But you know, if the thing that I think I will be very heartened by if this ever happens is kind of board games, table games, and you know, games in general becoming more global. Like our games come out of America, Europe, and sometimes Japan, right? And these games already have like we have code you know, we have phrases for that. Ameritrash, Eurogame, whatever we'll come up with for Japanese games. Small games, I guess, they're all very little. I mean, because they have to fit in their little homes, right? They have like, there's not a lot of space in Japan. I'm sorry, was that insensitive?
We forgive you.
He is trying, folks.
Listen. I don't know. They're a very convenient size, all Japanese games. String Railway is wonderful. Anyway. But on that front, right, like Oink Games makes amazing games that I've never seen like them. You know, String Railway is amazing. Tokyo Highway is amazing. Hanami Koji is amazing. And those are all just coming out of Japan, right? Like, what kind of games could we see out of, you know, cultures like South America, South American cultures?
No, Eric Martin of BGG keeps doing these lovely like threads of like, here's all the games I've heard of that are coming out of Brazil and Argentina. People, please translate those. Publishers, please buy them and distribute them. You know, there's like a game designer in who's hosting like tournaments in, I think, like Kenya and Uganda. Like, well, there's a what is he doing? What is he making? Yeah, there's African conventions that are being crowdfunded. Let's see what those are. Yeah.
So more of that, right? That's what I would love to see because, as you said, more stories, more unique perspectives. Because, like, you know, don't get me wrong, I love what we make because that's why we're here. But every time I see something new, I get just like a little bit of like my blood gets really excited. I'm like, oh yeah, what is this? Holy crap!
Yeah, it was really interesting earlier at the cafe when I was grabbing Starbucks. Someone saw my badge, which I don't have right now. I am sorry, I'm gonna get kicked out. And she's like, "What do you do? Or what is that all about?" And I was like, "Oh, it's a board game convention that's happening at that hotel right there." And she's like, "Oh, really? That's interesting. What kind of board games? Like Monopoly?" And that's how it always starts. And I told her a little bit about what's going on and take more opportunities to tell people about this industry. I know it can feel nerdy, and I know it can feel like, oh God, they're gonna find out I'm a nerd, you know. But take more opportunities to spread the word, because you never know who is going to glob onto this industry and really start loving it. I was out at the pier earlier yesterday, and I saw a family, an Asian family, playing this weird game of rock, paper, scissors that I've never seen before in my life. But they were playing rock, paper, scissors, and then if you beat the moderator, because there was a moderator, they would move closer to the pier, and whoever touched the pier first would win. And I'm just like, everybody games.
Yeah.
Everybody games.
We're humans, we play games.
You know, so
Animals play games.
You're almost doing a disservice not talking about your nerdy thing, you know. And let's try to make this industry as big and diverse as possible. So I'd like to. We're running a little bit.
Fred, who's just sitting
Fred.
over there looking hopeful.
Fred, I'm sorry. I love Fred so much.
The exclusion in the industry is. This was originally an aspirational question, right? I want to be here at SHUX 2047. I want to be on a panel that's about the history of the industry. And I want to talk about what we're talking about right now. And I want everyone in the audience who is your age right now to be giving me blank looks. I want it to be unfathomable. I want it to be. I want it to be in the dustbin of history, not to be forgotten, but to no longer be something that people have to spend tears crying over. And that's going to be a long way.
Can everyone there also just dress like the characters in Netrunner?
Primo fashion.
So I wanted to take this opportunity to open up for questions. If anybody wanted to ask a question
Or make a comment.
or make a comment, you're welcome to. We got microphones here.
I think eventually we'll set it up so that people can queue up behind the mic in the middle, because that seems to have worked pretty well so far. Sure.
It's just with the mic in one place, everyone knows where to go, rather than having to like do a ad hoc hands up.
Oh.
Flick the on switch, or just make sure the on switch is on, and then the soundboard will get you.
Well, if you just ask the question, we'll just
We can
repeat
repeat
it.
it, yeah.
Recording. So, yeah.
So, kind of a comment and also a question. So I have 3 young girls, and we're a little dinosaur in how we're raising them, and that we're not doing social media. They're not allowed Snapchat, they're not allowed Facebook accounts, they're middle school. And I want them making eye contact and having friends that they actually can interact with, and no video games. But we do.
Go
There was
for
a
it.
murmur.
Go
No
for
video
it.
games, you say.
They can do some, but they can't do a lot. So what I did is I started a kids game club. It's 5th to 8th graders. I teach a bunch of games. I run a club. It's super well attended. But I find as a mom with girls, it's very hard for me to talk other moms with girls into doing it. And I feel like there's such good games that could be just redressed and be better and be more marketable. Not better. Really good mechanic games could just have redressing. So you could take Small World, you could take Ethnos, redress them.
Make Ethnos anything else, right?
No, the industry could offer, you don't need to necessarily years in advance put out a product that's more girl friendly. You just take a really good game, a really good mechanic, and redress it. Yeah. You have a huge dollar. You have a lot of moms out there. They'll spend money on these games. You'll have more players. You'll have larger community, and then that from the bottom up changes the industry because now they have a market. And so we actually talk about redressing a lot of our games, and sometimes we'll even make up different themes for them because they're good games and they're solid, but you can just really broaden your market.
That's also like just an awesome creative exercise to have your kids doing.
Yeah.
Like,
That's super cool. Yeah, I think Lego's trying a bit of that, though. You occasionally get a bit of stick when it's like, hey, here's Nerf for girls, right? Nerf Rebel, but Nerf Rebel is super popular because they're awesome.
I am gonna say, like, John, one thing that's stuck in my head from the moment this panel had both
We got
of
like
us
5
on
minutes
it.
left
I
and
know.
a lot of questions, so we should, yeah.
But Imperial Assault and the choice to make a core set that had to have 2 women in it, and the only Jedi in the core set to be female, I think was you definitely having little girls in your mind and being like, I want a 13-year-old to sit down in Imperial Assault and be excited to play.
Yeah, we pushed the iconic Smuggler and Jedi to be female characters for that. Yeah.
I would add one very quick thing. I happen to know that there are people making that argument on pure business line reasons to companies. You will make more money if you do this
Oh, yeah.
way, and that actually works.
It does. It does. the Where's Ray Twitter hashtag from a couple years ago
Did
definitely
wonders.
got people to include Ray in much more merchandising. So yeah, make a big stink.
So this is sort of going back towards like the whole representation issue, because I kind of come more from a video game perspective and I'm starting to get into board games, and so I want to kind of pick your brain as to what suggestions might you guys have for incorporating more characters with mental health issues without it being that, oh, it's that character with that problem. Or having it specifically be, well, that's the problem with this character.
One of the ways you can do that is if the game isn't about something that the particular issue addresses, right? Like if your game is about a CCG, for example, and your character happens to have certain awkwardness when dealing with other people, if your fundamental game mechanics are about straight card gaming, then you can talk about it, you can address it, you can have it be there, but then the character is no longer defined by the issue. So you can actually cheat on a design level to choose what is, and you should. You choose what points matter. And if you choose to strategically de-emphasize a point, that creates an impression. And so your mechanics are tools. And what you choose to even have mechanicked is a tool. So a lot of what you can do is just try to have things that are not defining, because the game's not about that. And that actually gets you very far in a way that is not insensitive or unfair.
You know, we at Plaid Hat Games have the unique opportunity where we work on a lot of games that offer storytelling elements that aren't necessarily always reflective of a mechanical thing that takes place, but it's an opportunity to say, hey, this character and this character interacted and now a story happened. And one of the things that you can do in those situations is talk about those issues and their struggles and how that might be painful for the characters that you're playing, and be positive for the characters that you're playing. So it's taking a little bit more risk by maybe spending a little bit more on developing a story, developing a narrative behind characters that sometimes are only representative of mechanics, you know? Go ahead.
I kind of wanted to just get, like, what is the attitude in the industry? Is it more that people, like, say, oh, we're going to make, like, a wizard game, and that's obviously, like, a bunch of old white dudes and stuff? Or is it more that, like, people think that we're not going to buy games that have diversity in it? Because for me, like, I'm like a cisgender straight white male, and I have the benefit of having like lots and lots of people that I can identify with. And for me, like, I find it quite boring. Like, I would like to I don't want to be like white guy number 4.
Yeah.
I would actually like to be able to choose somebody different. So is it that they don't think that people like me are going to buy a game that has diverse characters?
I can sort of field this, and I guess you can too. There's no monolithic approach, first of all, from companies as a whole or even within a company. Many designers out there actually do just think, yeah, more games about white people. What's the problem with that? And that's where they're coming from. And they're not thinking about like, oh, I need to worry about how well this is going to do. They're like, I'm a great designer. I want to make another game about white people. That's fine.
Well, I don't even think they're thinking that far, right? They're just like defaulting. It's like, I want a wizard. What's a wizard look like? Gandalf, sure. Yeah. And they're not even, it doesn't immediately occur to them, right? Because it's like, hey, because they have their defaults, they have their community, they have what they've seen. And if they're not actively thinking about it, they just go with what's easiest. Same with art, right? If I say, hey, draw a knight, right? Oftentimes the knight will be a white guy because, you know, either knights are historically white, and they'll not think about it, right? It's just unexamined.
A lot of these companies making games don't necessarily have art directors, don't necessarily have people that are thinking about what does this need to look like. They hire a freelance artist and say, I need 3 wizards, period. And that's all they do. So it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, and you have to actively think about it.
Yeah, because I just want to say, like, like I found out about this game, One Deck Dungeon, that I think all of the main characters are female. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world because it wasn't just it's the girl dungeon crawler game. Like it was just that's what the characters were, and I like thought it was super neat and made me really really want to buy that game because it's something different.
And go and support that. I will say also that we're slowly progressing past the idea that diverse games won't sell.
Right.
We're in the process of that change happening. It's apparently much worse if you're Marvel Comics trying to make diverse comics right now. But that's also among especially older, more established companies. They assume that the default is what's going to sell because that's who's always been in the community, and they don't understand a reason to change it. So there's also that view.
We have a unique thing that's going on in our industry is that we're one of the most people-facing industries. So you're always going to be interacting with this product for the most part with someone else. A lot of other media companies, they can go ahead and just like have the buyer, have a solo experience. So that is a good opportunity for us to then have that talk be a little bit easier for the customer base. I think then it's like, oh yeah, like I want to have a diverse friend group. I want to have people be more represented. I want everybody who's sitting down at my table to feel like they have. We could talk about this for hours. Yeah, we really could.
So ready.
We really could. But yeah, I think it, like we said, it falls on actual thought. You have to put that thought into it because a lot of artists too, they again just default white.
Yeah. Thanks a ton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is maybe for the audience. If people want to do like a LGBTQ mixer right after this, maybe congregate outside or something.
Hey,
cool.
hey.
Yeah.
Thank
Woo.
you.
Okay, and go to bars later. Davie Street is really close.
Davie Street is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is going to go back to the representation question. So much of what we have in characters is visual cues, right? Like I can tell by looking at a character whether it's male, female, what its race is, whether it's visually impaired or if it's missing an arm. But how do you represent, especially when you don't have the luxury of giving a character a backstory, right? Because your rules book isn't you can't make it 50 pages. How do you represent those non-visual
So
aspects?
this is something that's very important to me and is something that I have a lot of trouble with. I'm going to say we haven't figured out a true solution, but there have been interesting experiments in the form, right? So like we have Netrunner has a trans character, but a lot of people don't know because the character presents as their identified gender, and they are generally passing in that way. They're like maybe slightly androgynous, but that's like it. And only if you dig into the lore are there hints that this character is trans, and does that count as visibility, right? And I'm not 100% sure it does, but on the other hand, if you make the character so like clearly XYZ, like for something that is not visible, you end up having to exaggerate characteristics and it might look token. And so it's a really fundamental challenge, and I think there's validity on various levels, but I think being sort of excited about it in the marketing end might be one of the big solutions, like how Pathfinder introduced their trans iconic and just said, hey, we're introducing our first trans iconic, and she's super cool, and it's like, and making that a part of her character and an interesting part of her character with cool fiction.
Yeah, so that's something that
I think that's cool.
One of the
it's
things
hard.
you could do is like you could make it part of the marketing
Yeah.
package,
Yeah.
or even you can have an online resource.
Right.
Sure,
Learn
yeah.
more about this character.
Right, like just if you look at their Wikipedia, their profile on the fan wiki, right, have like, hey, they are.
The only thing I would add there is an unfortunate resource constraint issue and a willingness to spend money on writers and story people and so on issue that is an ongoing issue. Obviously, as a storytelling writing guy, I am biased. But it is something where you can often use external to the game resources to help communicate those points. And partially it's a very good investment because the people who are looking for that want it. And I'm not even saying you shouldn't, it's just acknowledge again that the developer who does go that extra mile, has devoted that time, and recognize it and mention that to your friends, right?
Or it's something, I guess, you could leave up to the community to make that decision for you.
Sure, yeah.
You
absolutely.
can. There are other issues with that, but you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't mean to.
Yeah, we are running low on
We are
time,
over
but
time.
let's go ahead and
Yeah,
take
we'll
these
do the last
guys.
two.
So we'll
We can
take
do the
your-
last
you'll
two.
take your guys'
Yeah,
questions.
we'll take you
It's
guys
cool.
real quick.
The next talk is me and Fred anyway, so like.
I had a question about bootleg copies because I had a friend who went to Vietnam and he came back with a version of Masks in Vietnamese and English. And I know that the industry is trying to crack down on that. But you were talking about getting more people to play games, not just in the US, Europe, Japan. Vietnam, like a lot of people I know from Vietnam wouldn't know about video games unless they had these bootleg copies. So what are your opinions?
On like piracy in general and like on piracy in foreign markets specifically?
I don't support piracy, but I think it would be beneficial to try to distribute to
Right. I mean,
these countries.
translation is expensive.
Yeah.
And if if other countries are passionate enough to do the translation and to try and like produce something, like personally, I'm fine with it, but like I don't have skin in the game in that front, right? Like, but also if that's not a market you're serving in the first place, then I don't see how it matters significantly. But I am not a very good businessman, so.
I want Fred to answer this because Fred is actually a lawyer.
I am not providing legal advice. None of you is my client, and this is not actually a legal opinion. I say that for my protection.
Yes.
And I actually mean every word I say. I think this is as much an ethics and culture issue as it is a legal issue, right? And I think in terms of the practical reality, most of the time, it is not worth a company's while to pursue the legal solution that they would probably be entitled to. So I actually think it's an interesting question from a legal perspective, but it is not truly one that is resolved that way, right? As for whether or not it should happen, I think you raise a really interesting question that really could take an hour, right? And the problem is we're next.
Yeah,
and
and,
I
eaten
don't
10
mean
minutes
to
of our
dodge
time.
the question. It's just that I can't even begin to lay out the fundamental facts and reasoning I'd use as the building blocks to get to where I want to answer in the time it would take for the two of us to do our next panel. So,
Oh, that's totally fair.
yeah, snag me after. I'm happy to keep talking about that. It's just I can't do it now without trade-offs that are probably a bad play. Yeah.
You know, it's a difficult issue because the companies don't want their products to be taken and stolen. They worked very hard on those products, and the only way that we get to continue making them is if people buy them. You know, one of the things we did we kind of ignored in the early days is people did translations on BGG of rule books and things like that, and those are ways that they can still buy our products and see translations of that. But there are certain games that just is not practical for, and it's a complicated issue. But the best way is to get people that maybe do have the means, maybe do have the ability to, would like to translate in those things, get them talking to the companies that produce those games and seeing if they could go ahead and be a champion of that in those areas.
No, you make a really good point, and thank you for bringing that up. Definitely, as being part of the board game community, I think we should all rely on each other to help others who aren't able to get access to these games. So thank you for that. That's a good point.
No problem.
Thank you.
Accessibility.
Well, we are very out of time, but thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate seeing all of you here.
You guys have been lovely.
Yes. And thank you guys for joining me, so it wasn't just me.
You were never alone.
We have posters, Dead of Winter posters, with the entire cast of Dead of Winter on one poster.
They're
If you
glorious.
guys are interested, please take one or many. It doesn't matter.
Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the con.